My name is Peter Felix. I'm chairman of the Scientific Exploration Society, and it's my great pleasure to welcome today to our Meet Our Explorers podcast series, Mark Beaumont, athlete, cyclist extraordinaire, explorer, businessman, entrepreneur, and also member of the Scientific Exploration Society Advisory Board. Welcome, Mark.
Well, thank you for having me. Lovely to speak.
It's a pleasure. And Mark, you've had such an interesting and varied life so far. I want to take you through, the key aspects of your development as an athlete and as a cyclist. So can we start there and then move on to other issues concerning your business life and so on? But what took you to cycling, and how did you develop as an athlete in your early years?
Well, in terms of a potted history of the cycling, I guess I'll always be best known for pedaling around the planet a couple of times, which is an 18,000-mile race. If you're going for the record, which I have a couple of times, it's quite inspiring at the start of 2026 to see one person this year going to try and break that record, Lael Wilcock from Alaska, and at least two other contenders wanting to give it a go. I retook that record back in 2017. I guess what brought me to cycling around the planet and the length of Africa and the Americas and all these other big cycling expeditions was in my formative years, growing up in the foothills of the Highlands of Scotland. Horse riding and cycling were really my main outdoor pursuits. I was homeschooled until I was in high school, which meant that getting around the farm was either, by pony or by bicycle. And that quite naturally led to going on some adventures as a teenager, cycling across Scotland when I was 12, John O'Groats to Land's End when I was 15. But this concept of going around the planet, I think a lot of listeners will remember when Ellen MacArthur broke the record for solo-handed non-stop sailing around the planet in, I think it was February 2005. I was at university at the time, and it utterly inspired me. I'm not a sailor, but it was just one of those feats of endurance and human spirit that really inspired me. And I went from thinking I was going to leave university and become an accountant to thinking, could I take all these amateur adventures on the bicycle and go for the ultimate, which is can I do the Ellen and go around the planet, albeit on a bicycle, not a sailing boat? And well, the rest is history, as they say. And I'm very fortunate, but it was part of the plan to really build a broadcasting career alongside. And it's really the television and the broadcast which has given me the platform and the opportunity to go on expeditions for 20 years now.
Fascinating. Obviously, in order to build your strength as an adventure long distance cyclist, you had to become very fit. When did you start realizing that it would be almost a kind of professional obligation to keep fit and develop a regime that would allow you to do the things you've done?
Well, I was never, as a child, put into cycling clubs or racing. So the competition element was really a race with myself. I've always been far more drawn to the wanderlust and the adventure and the exploration of it than I have, beating somebody else. I'm 6'3", I'm a big lad. I look more like a rugby player than a bike rider. And so I certainly never grew up thinking that I would be a professional athlete. For me, I'd say it was time in the great outdoors, and cycling was more of a mode of transport than something I thought of in terms of formal training. And I would take that all the way through to the first cycle around the planet when I was 24. Yes, I was fit and yes, I'd trained, but looking back now, it seems like kindergarten. I took it as seriously as I could at the time, but I knew nothing really about sports science or formal training. I didn't have a team around me. And then, of course, through my 20s and 30s, as my profile grew and as I built a much deeper understanding of the sport, inevitably these things got a lot more professional. And you towards the end of my racing career, where I was taking on records like the North Coast 500 record, my second time around the planet, Race Across America and others. I had this, incredible teams around me, big budgets, and you're training by numbers. It's no longer the wanderlust and the culture and the people and the places. It's now your functional threshold power and training 25 hours a week, which is a completely different way of thinking about it. But I'm quite fortunate, I think, to have had both of those chapters in my adventure career. One very much about the culture, the people, the place, and the sheer adventure of it, and the other, which is the professionalism around really being able to put all my cards on the table and figure out what's humanly possible.
Tell us a bit more about the first phase, Mark, when you were an amateur adventure cyclist. You went around the world without a team of support. How did you plan it, and what was the route you took?
Well, I mean, the routes are really interesting to talk about in the context of 2026 because the geopolitics has changed beyond recognition in the last 2 decades.
Yes.
So my first pedal around the planet was Paris through to Istanbul on leg one, Istanbul to Calcutta leg two. So that's Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, India. So that really is the interesting leg culturally and geographically. So you're cutting, Turkey's vast. I don't think people quite realize how big and mountainous Turkey is. Uh, Crossing into the Azerbaijan region of Iran up through to Tabriz, and then cutting sort of southeast through Iran, Qom, Bam, into Baluchistan, across the border into the Pakistan side, still in the Baluchi desert, skirting around the Helmand province of the Helmand, and then to the first main city in Pakistan, which is Quetta, down to the Indus Valley, Jacobbabad, up to Lahore, and then across North India. And I mean, it's a route that you just couldn't do now. After that, I did Bangkok, Singapore, across Australia through the Nullarbor, the length of New Zealand, and then landed in California to go across to Florida before the final sprint finish from Lisbon back up to Paris. So it's a 27,000 kilometer or 18,000 mile race around the planet. You can actually take a whole variety of routes, and people have over the decades, but you do have to always go in the same direction, hit antipodal points, which I'm sure the geographers will understand is 2 points on the opposite side of the planet within a small range of each other. And there's a bunch of other rules around riding the same bike and whatnot. So it's fascinating. The second time I pedaled around the planet in 2017, I took a much more northerly tier through, again starting in Paris, but this time going through Russia, Mongolia, China, so flying out from Beijing. And then by the time I got to North America, doing Anchorage to Halifax. So most of those miles done in Alaska and Canada rather than the southern tier across the US. So actually very different routes. There's only really one way across Australia and up New
Right.
Zealand, but the other parts of the world were completely different despite being the same record.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think many people would be awestruck at the fact that you traveled literally, around the world, all through all these countries that many people are not even sure where they are, and you did it unsupported. Explain that to us. How did you make this happen? Stopping when you could, or did you actually arrange ahead of time support for yourself? How did you do that? Because that sounds like an incredible challenge.
Yeah, I mean the first time around the world, like any first grand adventure, looking back, had a huge amount of naivety about it. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't know what you
Mm.
don't know, and the world was a very different place. That's not to say that there wasn't challenges, and if you go back 20 years, there was all the talk around the sort of the axis of evil, and if you remember what was happening in geopolitics back then. So it was certainly challenging to head through Iran and Pakistan in the route that I did, albeit easier than you could now. Um, but I think the main part is not just the practicalities of the perceived risks or the real risks as they exist, but also your lived experience. And you'll never replicate the sheer excitement and emotions of the first time you go on a big expedition, because now, having done expeditions to 130 nations and territories, not just has the world changed, but I've changed. If I was to reread The Man Who Cycled the World, my first book, it's like reading somebody else's adventure, because I barely recognize myself 20 years later. And in fact, my
Right.
daughter has been listening to the audiobook of that adventure recently, and it's really fascinating hearing her reaction to sort of daddy's adventure from long before she was born. Because I'm a totally different person now, and you've got to be able to take that sort of step into the unknown, I guess. And I'll always remember pedaling into Iran scared. I didn't even pitch my tent that first night because I didn't know what to find, and I slept in a tunnel under the road. And then I got taken in by a family when I got to Briz, and they looked after me and gave me a much better introduction to the culture, and were incredibly kind and said, look, as you pedal through Iran, you can sleep in mosques. Any travelers will be looked after and given a rug to sleep on and a cup of tea. And
Right.
that was the truth. It would be like cycling across the UK and being able to sleep in any church that you found. I mean, the hospitality was extraordinary through the entire Islamic world.
That's amazing. And in terms of practicalities, just making sure your bike was running properly, was that just happenstance? If you broke down, then you hope for the best?
I tried to, on that first cycle around the world, it was really touring style. So 5 panniers, carrying a lot of kit.
Right.
I had quite a lot of issues with broken spokes and broken wheels on that first cycle. And yeah, I had to be pretty self-reliant. And it's always that fine balance with any expedition kit between sort of fixability and reliability, trying to choose the kit that's as resilient as possible, but ultimately sometimes having to compromise on weight or what you carry so that you just hope it's tough enough to last the course. And it's interesting thinking about some of my later decisions, say the 10,000 kilometer record, the length of Africa, going on carbon bikes with electronic gears and hydraulic brakes. You go into a world there which is not fixable on the roadside. No bike shop in Ethiopia is going to be able to sort that out for you, but you've made the choice around, kit that you hope is reliable enough. But the reality is most Western bikes are not going to be fixable as you travel through these far more remote parts, and you do need to be able to sort of figure it out as you go. And of course, anyone who's done any major expeditions gets quite good at bodging. And you know, the further you are from home, I find the better people are at fixing stuff. We're so used to, I'm speaking to you in Edinburgh in Scotland here. People are so used to when something breaks, they just buy a new one. Whereas you go to so many parts of the planet on expedition, and the first port of call is to fix, is to remake, is to reimagine, and that's just such a wonderful skill set, which is often lost in a society where you can just buy another one. So yes, of course, things go wrong all the time, but you carry what you can without being, laden down too much.
Yes. I think what you said earlier that essentially your first trip was as much, you were 24 years old, you were exploring the world, and your method of doing it was to cycle, which was something you knew how to do. So, for many of our members at the Scientific Exploration Society, many of our members will do expeditions on foot or camel or horse. You did it on a bike, but essentially that was the main motivation from what you were saying, that you really wanted to explore the world.
Yeah, going back to those earlier trips, it was definitely a mode of transport. My three great passions were skiing, horse riding, and cycling. And clearly, cycling will get you the furthest. And I wasn't up for skiing across a pole or something. It's interesting. I've always been more interested in expeditions that include culture as opposed to complete wilderness. I have rowed or attempted to break the record for rowing the Atlantic and done expeditions in the high Arctic, but I find those expeditions where you're earning that change through powering yourself, but there's that tapestry of culture in place, and you can sort of see how one thing becomes the next. We're so used to traveling to a place and comparing it to home, but the wonderful thing when you cycle across a landscape is you have that amazing range, which you would never do if you were walking, or you would be completely cut off from if you were in a vehicle or a motorbike. So I think that's probably why I opted for the bike. Riding a pony wouldn't have got me quite so far, or
No.
allowed me to do the same things, and so yeah, it's interesting then, of course, once you get some recognition for something, you get sort of put in a box. And I remember coming back from that first cycle around the planet, really planning to go back to a finance career, and
Mm.
the BBC turning around and saying, well, that half-hour documentary that we were going to make for BBC Scotland was so fantastic that we're going to make it into a four-part series and put it on BBC One network at 7 o'clock on a Saturday evening. And that level of profile, not just sort of on the back pages in the cycling press, but actually
Mm.
across, the wonderful thing about those early documentaries is it wasn't cyclists. It was people sitting at home with their families, just sharing adventures, proper expedition,
Mm.
and
Mm.
a view of the world through myself out there on my own for half a year. And of course, then the BBC came back and said, "Well, that was great. Where do you want to go next?" And I found myself spending 9 months going for my
Yes.
last to Tierra del Fuego, following the Cordillera, the Rockies and the Andes top to toe. And then I sort of got, pigeonholed as a cyclist. So it slightly surprised people when I tried to then do other stuff in my career, Arctic and mountaineering and ocean rowing and whatnot, because I was sort of a cyclist, and I was sort of a cyclist by accident because the bike was just the mode of transport for that first big expedition.
But I think this happens in a lot of people's careers. Suddenly there's a turn in the road and it looks like opportunity, and suddenly things change. For you, it sounds as if accountancy, was beginning to recede as a profession, but I get the impression that the world of business and finance was still in your mind. We'll come on to that in a moment. But it sounds to me as if the BBC taking that interest in you really was the start of your professional cycling and exploring career. Is that fair?
Yes, I'd clearly sort of taken the initiative and taken the idea to them.
Mm.
It wasn't like I had any contacts in the media world. I didn't even have any aspirations to have a media career. When I first walked boldly into BBC Scotland, as it was back in Queen Margaret Drive, just off the Botanic Gardens, and chatted to people during their lunch hour and asked who was interested to talk about an expedition to cycle around the planet. I was still a student. I had no idea that, when I was first given a 2-page contract and they didn't pay me a penny, and it was just a case of, well, we'll give you a camera, and if you manage to make a success of this, we'll try and make a half-hour doc out of it. It was
Right.
pretty humble beginnings. I had no aspiration at that point to have a TV career. For me, it was simply a way to thank my sponsors, and to get some coverage for what I was doing. It was through working with the great late David Peat, an absolute legend in the BBC Scotland filmmaking world. He sort of started his career back in the 60s, photographing Billy Connolly and Big Banana Feet and street photography in Glasgow, and ended his career doing big expeditions with me all over the planet. And it was that love for filmmaking and the real privilege of capturing these places that most people will never get to go and see that instilled the love for the storytelling element of it. And it turned it from a bit of a utility to something that was the creative side, and something that I learned and enjoyed, and
Mm.
starting behind the camera and doing the filming, and then moving more into the presenting and being in front of the camera. And so you're right, my early career had lots of twists and turns. I definitely was watching my peer group in those early years going, at what point do I fit back into a finance career? And then, of course, I was having far too much fun doing major expeditions. And by the time I got to 30 and was getting married, I sort of thought, well, there's no point in trying to figure out how I sort of quote unquote fit back in. I'm very much on my own path here. I'm enjoying what I'm doing. It's successful business as well. I wasn't living life like a student. I could, stand on my own 2 feet. And it's so funny in the education system that we've got, because, you're sort of, that playground mentality sort of institutionalizes people to sort of check in as to where they are in the quote unquote system. And of course, if you're fortunate enough to have a professional career doing expeditions, well, you better stop worrying about that quite quickly, because you're very much on your own path. And even people who I now know within the adventure and exploration community who do this professionally, we've all got very different ways of structuring our lives, making it work. And you get a sense that some people are sort of escaping the rat race and have sort of tried something, and then sort of, and whereas some people have set out very purposefully from the beginning to make it work. And I'm definitely one of them. I was never running away from anything. I had
Mm.
a passion for adventure. I had a passion for journeys. I grew to love the filmmaking side of it, and I took it very seriously. I make no apologies for the fact that I worked with big sponsors, built these incredible high performance teams. I was not doing it in a haphazard fall out of bed and hope for the best way. It was my career.
Mm.
To a smaller extent, it still is. And in the adventure world, I've faced a small amount of criticism for that, because I think there's a wonderful sort of British tradition of slightly happy-go-lucky adventurers. And
Yes, the gifted amateur.
yeah, whereas, I made no apologies from the start. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it to the best of my abilities, and I'm
Yeah.
taking my career as seriously as Chris Hoy or Andy Murray, and being completely upfront about that as to the scale of the ambitions. And I've been very
Mm.
fortunate to then have a platform which has helped other people do extraordinary things. And I'm 43 now, and been doing it for long enough where I can see that there's another generation coming up behind me who are taking ideas and inspirations from some of the things that I've been involved in, and that's great fuel to the fire. I'd be crazy to say that that didn't mean something to me. It's wonderful to
Yeah.
not just be able to take on your biggest dreams, but also to be able to share them in a way that helps others.
No, I think that's completely right. And I think it's one of the inspiring things about the society is that there are quite a number of young people who are clearly following the same path, testing whether they do have the capability to make exploration a career. And as you and I know, there are a number who have succeeded in doing that. It's a challenging path, but it's very rewarding. Mark, take us on a quick guided tour through the expeditions and the cycling adventures that you have done in the last 20 years. Just a quick overview.
Okay, so I think we've covered the first pedal around the planet. And
Yes.
that really spawned a huge interest off the back of the BBC coverage and other people going for the record. So that very quickly tumbled. I remember at the finish, people said, it's unbelievable, broken the world record by 2 months and set at a whole new level. Will that ever be broken? And of course, now you look back and it looks like kindergarten. I pedaled around the planet in 194 days. And the record, which I now have, is 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes. So
Wow.
it really is a different league, albeit fully supported now. The Americas expedition was my longest to date. It was 9 months. The mission there was to climb the highest peaks, so Denali in the north and Aconcagua in the south, and ride the length of the spine of the Americas, so the Rockies and the Andes top to toe, which was an 11,000-mile ride. I loved that. It was only time constrained by the need to get between the mountains within the climbing season. And within that, I had time to stop and explore and immerse myself in cultures and be a bit more relaxed about the exploration side of it, which was amazing. I then had a bit of a departure from cycling for 3 years and did a lot of ocean rowing. The truth of the matter is, I always was fascinated by the concept of, well, yes, I'd cycled around the world, but I hadn't really been around the world. The equator is 24,900 miles, and of course, land-based circumnavigations are only 18,000. So to do a true circumnavigation, which has rarely been done, certainly not non-stop, you've got to cross the oceans as well. So that concept fascinated me for a long time, and I dedicated 3 years to figuring out if I could join the dots, so to speak, and cross the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. I got my opportunity to sort of do my apprenticeship, if you like, in a BBC One documentary called Rowing the Arctic, where I was put on board as the filmmaker and athlete on a six-person crew, a triple scull, to row through the high Arctic, so to take a rowing boat further north than anyone had ever gone before. And that was a very odd place to learn to ocean row, albeit all of our training was in the Solent in the south of England. But to then spend a couple of months navigating the ice fields and the islands of the Nunavut territory of Canada was an odd place to start to think about the oceans. I then went for the Atlantic world record, which was Tarfaya, Morocco to Port St. Giles, Barbados. And cutting that story very short, after 28 days, we capsized and I spent 14 hours in the water trying to get rescued, which was a very, very close call with death.
Goodness me.
And coming home from there, I slightly shelved the expeditions and thought, well, I'll continue with my television career and I'll focus more on presenting sport as opposed to doing dangerous expeditions. And I did that for a number of years. I led the delegation for the BBC in the build up to the 2014 Commonwealth Games. I had the opportunity to go around the entire Commonwealth nations and territories and filming athletes across 17 sports, which I loved. But I was jealous. I wanted to be doing what they were doing, not what I was doing. And it was a really interesting point to come back and say, well, do I want to spend the rest of my life holding a microphone or do I want to be exploring? And well, the choice was simple. And a year later, I broke the Africa world record, Cairo to Cape Town. And that ended up really being the quote unquote training ride to come back and retake the round the world record, which I did in 2017. That sort of potted history is some of the bigger expeditions. There's been lots of smaller ones, which have been a matter of weeks or a month or so. But in terms of the major chapters, the big expeditions, that took us through to 2017. After that, there was a period in my career which was really focused on time trialing and going much faster. There was much less exploration, and it was just about trying to break records. So trying to do the first crossing of the US in less than 6 days as a two-man crew, smashing the Land's End John O'Groats record in a pair, things like the North Coast 500 record and others. And I'm very proud of my sort of time doing that, but I've got absolutely no itch to go back and do it again. It was nice for a few seasons to put all my cards on the table and go, what's humanly possible with all this amazing sports science and aerodynamics and all the rest of it. But having done that, it definitely lacked, I guess, the original reason that I got into all this, which was far more the sheer wanderlust of it. And I still push myself. I'm off to Chile on Thursday actually to do a mountaineering expedition. But and there's always a competition with myself element where I'm trying to push myself relatively hard. I wouldn't be a particularly good nomadic traveler. I like being in a hurry. But when you go to the extremes and you're just head down time traveling, you definitely miss that element of the place you're in. You might as well be anywhere by the time you're
Right.
you're doing that.
Amazing. And when you were preparing for these big expeditions, you'd indicated that by now, you'd got sponsors and support and so on, but they're major expeditions. They require a lot of planning. Tell us a little bit about that and what did you need in the way of support to achieve these world records?
They do take a lot of planning. And anyone who's done major expeditions, amateur or professional, will know that the hardest part is often getting to the start line. Once you're out there, you're doing the bit that you have dreamt of, and it might be tough, but it's your choice to be there, and you're not waiting for somebody else to unlock that potential for you, whether that's funding or recruiting your team. At least when you're out there and it's tough, it's up to you whether you carry on or not. Whereas often when you're planning major expeditions, you might be driving it, but you can't do it yourself. You need other people to jump on the bus, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, the first time I pedaled around the world, there was my flatmate who was doing his master's in economics was my treasurer. My mum was what we call base camp.
Right.
I had to teach her how to open a laptop and do emails. As she organised the levy, the Bellucci Transport Police, to give me an armed escort through the desert. Go mum. I think back to those early days, and it's your friends and family, isn't it? Now you then fast forwards to when I was doing, say, the Americas or the Commonwealth project. I had a whole team in the BBC. I had a whole department. I had sort of 20 people working on those projects, and I was the man in the field, if you like. And I would often have a filmmaker, a sound person, an editor. I'd have a whole production team with me. By the time I came to retaking the Round the World record in 2017, 40 people worked on that project across 2.5 years. So I was racing for 2.5 months, but it took 2.5 years. It took in cash about £500,000, in kind.
Yeah.
So it was a seven-figure budget, and I split them in three. So I had logistics, performance, and media. I had a South African media crew because they were sort of expedition hardened. They'd done this before, and frankly, it was more cost effective to hire a crew out of South Africa than out of London. So my crew for the Round the World in 80 Days were based on 3 continents, and it was incredible. Led by Laura Penhall on the performance side, Mike Griffiths, ex-army, on the logistics side, and guess who's still there? Mum, base camp. And so even though the expeditions got a lot more expensive and professional, it was always quite nice to have a family at the heart of it.
Absolutely. And of course, modern communications have made at least keeping in touch easier, even though, as you say, geopolitics have not been helpful. You mentioned.
It's a really interesting point, Peter, because communications have changed, media has changed, but not always to the betterment. So, when I first pedaled around the planet, there was long periods where I couldn't communicate, and going into Iran, I felt very cut off, and people could track me. I sort of this brick of a GPS tracker that weighed about a kilo. These things could be smaller than your phone now, like an EPIRB. By the time I went on to my second major expedition in the Americas, I was out there for the first pedal around the planet, filming it onto a camera which was filming onto mini DVs. That's reel-to-reel cassette, so that's still analog. And then I was sending back boxes of tapes from Calcutta or Singapore and hoping that they would make it back to the BBC. Now, of course, by the time I went on my second major expedition, social media had been invented, and they asked me to take one of the very first BBC Twitter accounts. And I thought, what a nuisance. This is never going to catch on. And it changed the communication from something I lived for myself out in the places I was in to then be made into a film afterwards to something that was real-time storytelling. And
Right.
I carried a BGAN, which is a mobile satellite dish, on the bike during the Americas, so I could sit in the Atacama Desert or the middle of Patagonia and do live
Mm.
streams to BBC Breakfast or whoever else, and satellite phone and the rest of it. So yes, communication and safety have improved in many ways and got lighter and simpler, but it does very much change the experience when you're at the heart of it.
Yes.
I slightly harken back to the want to
Mm.
go on an expedition where I can communicate when I want to, as opposed to the imperative to update the world every 10 minutes.
Yes. Did you feel that in a way that it was intrusive? That the original experience was perhaps a little more pure, and this was more contrived, if you like. But
I think it
it
just,
is what it is.
yeah, I always encourage adventurers and explorers now who are taking on their first big expeditions. I think it's important, of course, to figure out how you communicate and how you build your quote unquote brand, but do it first. Do it for yourself first. Get out there and
Yeah.
make sure that you're living your dream. If you can then share in an authentic and interesting way, fantastic. I worry about people who feel they need to almost build a brand first before they do anything.
Mm.
A, from a credibility perspective, and B, just so you actually enjoy it and get something out of it. If you are lucky enough to turn expeditions into your job, then you've got to, when you're going to hard places and doing spending huge amounts of time on your own, you have to remember why you're doing it to begin with. And I think it's very hard to do it because somebody else has told you to do it. Many other jobs you sort of can turn up and work for them, so to speak. But I think if you're doing major
Mm.
expeditions, it has to be a deep intrinsic motivation. Nobody can tell you to do this. And I hate it when people feel they have to go on expeditions to sort of feed the profile of what they're doing or to pay the bills for the next year. It sort of oddly takes away from the reason that most people get into expeditions to begin with. Now, clearly, if you then have the opportunity to do it professionally and make a career out of it, great. But the communication element of it, significantly change your experience. And it's a real privilege when you get to come back and write books because anything else you might do, social media, television, even, well, I guess podcasts are quite pure, but there's very few forms of communication which are your story, your words. The others are often sort of truncated versions of what happened or snippets of reality or, edited by
Mm.
somebody else. Whereas the wonderful privilege when you then get to write a book or have a long form conversation is it's your story, your words, and you really get time to invest in that. So yeah, I would just encourage anyone who's sort of getting into this world to really think about these communication elements. Because I was at this amazing event last night in Glasgow with the McLean boys, the brothers who recently rode the Pacific Ocean, and
Yes.
they were talking
They're going to be talking to the society, in fact, next week. So,
wonderful. Yeah,
like,
no,
like,
no,
yeah.
Lucky Ewan and Jamie, they're great guys. I've known them for years, and but they were talking about that. How do you spend 139 days rowing the Pacific Ocean and yet because of Starlink be completely connected with people all the time? Well, you can ask them about that, but I think they found that really tough because it takes you away from the reason you went to these incredibly isolated places and the privilege of being on expedition.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. Mark, you'd rather glossed over some of the challenges in terms of personal safety. There was one you mentioned where you were capsized, but tell us a bit about moments when things went wrong and how you survived.
The cycling expeditions have had clearly some risks. I think Russia is probably the most dangerous place I've ever cycled. The trucks,
Mm.
the road safety. I had a very bad crash just east of Moscow and fell on my face and my outstretched arm. So I could have fractured my radial head, which is the small bone in your elbow, and shunted in and broke some teeth. And you're really faced with a decision point as to how quickly can you carry on? Is it safe to carry on? And if you go to the doctor and spend too much time worrying about it, then you're not going to break the record. So, there's some really
Mm.
tough decisions on expeditions when those things happen. The biggest danger the first time cycling around the world, weirdly, after talking about Iran and Pakistan and all the places that people worried about, was when I got to the deep south, when I got to Louisiana. And there was one really tough day when a car jumped the lights at a crossroads. I went straight into the front of the car over the bonnet, broke the windshield, and the front end of the bike was buckled. I was a bit bashed and bruised. And then I got taken to the city of Lafayette that evening to get the bike fixed and was promptly mugged. And my, camera and wallet and valuables were taken from me by a gang, as
Oh,
I tried to sort of protect myself in the motel I was staying in. So, you got one day where you get run over and mugged. It was a bit odd and ironic that with all the worries of going through the Middle East and Asia, actually it was to happen back in the US.
yeah.
So I mean, these things can happen anywhere, and you've got to be streetwise. So I don't carry a huge trauma from these things. You just got to be sort of careful as you go.
Mm.
The times where, sadly, I have witnessed people paying that ultimate price and come close to dying myself is in the mountains and in the oceans. I mean, we all know that human beings are the most dangerous animals out there. So having been to very remote parts, it's not really the the bugs or the beasties that worry me. It's normally people.
Mm.
Although I do fundamentally trust most people, and most people are kind, or the natural environment. And it's climbing in the mountains. We witnessed some people sadly falling to their death on Denali, and I mentioned before the capsize in the Atlantic. When we went over, the stern cabin flooded. The boat should have self-righted, but because the hatch was open on a change of shift, it stayed upside down. And we went from thinking we would broke another world record, and within days of the finish in Barbados to 14 hours fighting to survive. One of the guys, an ex-Israeli special forces guy, very 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 strong athlete, nearly drowned in the initial capsize, and so keeping him on the surface was the first priority.
Mm.
Then salvaging the VHF, the flares, the sat phone, all the kit that was needed for our survival was not straightforward. All these things that are quite good fun when you're doing your training and in the wave pool are a bit harder when you're 500 miles offshore in high seas. And so, yeah, 5 minutes in training, 45 minutes when you're actually in harm's way. And then from that point, getting everyone in the life raft, calling the Mayday, and eventually attracting a Taiwanese cargo vessel, which rerouted
Really?
over 100 nautical miles to find us in the middle of the night. So you now imagine you're bobbing around on a life raft the size of a kitchen table in the middle of the night, and you're trying to get from that onto a cargo vessel, which is 180 meters long with a 9 meter deck height. And of course, it's the middle of the night. So we could see it like a Christmas tree on the horizon. They couldn't see us, so you're sending flares up, and then they come within range. You get them on the VHF. There's communication issues there. You've then got to get the life raft alongside this thing the size of a football field, and it nearly ran us over a couple of times before we, the third time of trying, as it circled around in the night, managed to grab the lines that the sailors were throwing off the deck, and then you've got to try and get on the rope ladder and climb for your life. And all of that sounds quite fun, and in hindsight, but we so nearly didn't come back from that one. And
Right.
yeah, it was a lot of lessons as to the difference between knowing what to do and doing it, doing the training and having the physical ability. But half the crew really did not cope well in that scenario, and there was a sort of
Mm.
an unwritten underlying assumption that certain people would step up whilst other people did nothing. And
Right.
it's really scary on expedition when you really test what happens when you turn the heat up.
Fascinating. I'm exhausted, Mark, just from that experience. Fascinating. You've really given us a wonderful overview of your very exciting life in cycling and exploration. But I know that you've got another life, which is in the world of business and entrepreneurship. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I've always been very motivated by sustainability issues in particular.
Mm.
I guess this comes as a direct line from having filmed all over the world and experienced places that so many people get to read in National Geographics
Mm.
and in the news, but don't necessarily get to see for themselves. So when you've actually been through the high Arctic or the middle of the oceans or the low-lying Pacific Islands, it really does make sense as to how human beings are leaving a very, very heavy footprint on planet Earth. And so what can you do? So what can you do? And within Scotland, I've kept a close connection with higher education I'm honorary president for Scottish Student Sport. I'm patron for Entrepreneurial Scotland, and I'm very passionate about giving young people, helping young people have the quiet confidence to back their ideas, to really step out and be valued for who they are, not just their education. So you put these two interests together around young people and education and also sustainability. And throughout my 30s, I was getting more involved in investing in some of these ideas and opportunities and technologies that I saw. And then I formalized that in 2019 by taking one of the angel networks that I was a part of and supporting them to scale into a managed fund, a regulated EIS fund in the UK. And so, with a real focus on science and technology across human health and environmental sustainability, my passion there was to try and create more value creation, support these companies more, and also to be able to follow on, to be able to support them beyond that spin out from university or company creation stage. And it's gone well. Built the team to 8 with 2 associates in the US, raised 4 funds in 4 years, backed 18 companies. I've actually stepped back from that seed stage fund in the last 6 months. It's got to a really nice stage. I'd really like to focus my time and effort on other parts of my portfolio. I've always wanted that sort of engine room of early stage science and technology to be there, and I hope it continues with great gusto. I'm really looking at the next piece of the puzzle, which is scale up capital. How do you really make the impact with companies that have, found their market and needing to grow into international? So to give you some real examples, companies that are addressing microbead plastic pollution in the world oceans, or reducing the use of harmful chemicals in all sorts of industrial uses. Those are just 2. Sustainable agriculture. We've gone from topsoils that are many feet deep to often just centimeters, and we're within a generation in many parts of the world of desertification and not having topsoils that can sustain modern agriculture. So, these are things that I think deeply about, and I guess we need to encourage people to be systems thinkers around how you create, what's the role of government in all of this? How do you incentivize not just entrepreneurs and founders, but how do you create the rules of engagement across systems so that we can really address these systemic challenges? So maybe that's for a different podcast. But I spend, I don't know, 30-40% of my time involved in exploration, adventure, media, and I spend the rest of my time driving impact within human health and sustainability.
And of course, there are larger organizations out there that at least for a time, were focusing very much on sustainability. It seems as if politically it's gone off the boil a bit, which is worrying. But there still are organizations out there. Have you thought about leveraging with some of the bigger brand names, or you want to continue doing it essentially as your own venture?
No, absolutely. It's all about building relationships. There's 2 things that anyone listening to this needs to think about, and it's that courage to do things that are relevant to more than just yourself. There is no point when it's big macro issues. If we think about the next 25 years, the next 100 years, you've got to start with the community you're part of, your family, the people you work with, your town, your country. But then it's all about international relationships, because all these things are fundamentally connected.
Connected, yes.
So it's about trust. It's about shared values. It's about working with people who are trying to do similar things and leveraging, where are those 2 and 2 equals 5? So yeah, I've got very, very deep roots in Scotland, and then I've got slightly less deep roots across the UK, and it goes in those sort of concentric rings through Europe, the US, and the world. And as you go further from home for me, I more rely on those relationships, drive capital in, scale companies out, create value from people who've got similar interests. And no, absolutely. And it's why I very much see my role as an architect rather than a builder. I am not an accountant. I am not a lawyer. I am not a scientist, but I am somebody who's got a very, very broad network, who tries to create connections so that the organizations that I'm a part of can do more.
Well, Mark, you've taken us a wonderful journey through your very interesting life so far. At age 43, you still have a long way to go, which is very exciting. Thank you very much for giving us these insights. At the Scientific Exploration Society, as you know, There's a lot of common folk in terms of their aspirations and their activities. And so we're very happy that you are part of us and that you're on the advisory board. But we look forward to having more discussions like this. I think some of the themes you've talked about, particularly sustainability, is something that perhaps we can pay more attention to at the SES. So we look forward to talking to you more about that. But thank you very much for your time this morning and wish you well with your next venture, particularly in Chile. And please don't fall off that mountain.
I'll try my best.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks, Peter.